Fleet Commander Ussa Rel, standing at her own station, found her voice before the Grand Overseer found his. This is a fabrication, Grand Overseer, or at best an unverified claim designed to provoke hesitation. A single vessel, whatever exotic technology it may carry, cannot withstand concentrated fire from 50 dreadnoughts simultaneously. Allies or no allies, that is simple mathematics. I love that word mathematics, Marisol said, and there was something in the easy warmth of her voice that made the hair rise on the back of every human neck that would later hear the recording, and made something considerably less familiar crawl along the chitin of every Threll officer present. Everybody on your side of this conversation keeps bringing up math like it's supposed to scare me. Here's my math, Fleet Commander. You've got 50 ships and a century-old survey report that assumed we spent the last 100 years sitting still. I've got one ship, built with 100 years of help from people who actually bothered to get to know us instead of just filing us away as a diplomatic embarrassment, and about 4 minutes of actual work ahead of me before this is over. I'm not bluffing at you. I'm just telling you what's about to happen, the same way I'd tell you the weather. You are one ship, Kelvax Dur said, and this time he made sure his voice carried the full, unshakable weight of Concordance authority behind it, the voice that had ended 3 centuries of conflicts before they ever properly began. One ship, Captain, against 50, regardless of whatever exotic assistance your allies may have provided. Whatever that vessel is capable of, it cannot survive concentrated fire from an entire peacekeeping fleet. That is not arrogance on my part. That is simply the mathematics you claim to respect. Marisol's voice carried the particular texture of someone considering a point seriously before disagreeing with it completely. See, I do respect mathematics, Grand Overseer, genuinely. Math's never lied to me. But math's only as good as the numbers you feed it, and I don't think your math has the right numbers because your math thinks it knows what my shields can take. And it doesn't because nothing in your archive has ever fought us before, not the us we've actually become. You've got a spreadsheet with 50 rows on it, one for each of your ships, and you're very confident in that spreadsheet. I've got one row, built by 2 species who decided a banished people were worth investing in anyway. I promise you, one more time with real sincerity, you do not want to find out what's actually in my row. Kelvax Dur had built 3 centuries of unbroken command on his ability to read an opponent, to know precisely when a threat was substance, and when it was empty posture, and every instinct honed across that long career told him that the human woman on the other end of this channel was not bluffing, was not performing desperation, was not doing any of the things a cornered species did when facing annihilation. She sounded, if anything, faintly amused, the way a veteran might discuss a routine procedure performed 1,000 times before. That should have terrified him considerably more than it did. Instead, 3 centuries of unbroken dominance whispered a quieter, more dangerous truth in the back of his mind. That he had brought too large a fleet, made too public a demand, broadcast too confident an ultimatum across every surviving human channel, to retreat now over the unverified claims of a single captain, however unnervingly calm she sounded. I admire conviction, Captain, he said finally, proud of how level his voice remained. But conviction has never once stopped a particle beam, and it will not stop 50 ships firing in concentrated barrage. Stand down your vessel, transmit your surrender, and I will consider this provocation forgiven, along with a great deal of your species' outstanding diplomatic disgrace. Refuse, and I will order this fleet to fire, and you will discover precisely how much your allies' century of charity was actually worth. There was a pause on the channel, just long enough to be noticeable, and when Marisol spoke again, there was something new in her voice, something that had shed the last of its lightness, gone flat and cold and absolutely certain. You called my species banished, Grand Overseer, disgraced, not worth the compact's attention for 100 years. I want you to remember you said that, because I'm about to spend the next several minutes personally correcting the record, and I want it very clear in your mind exactly what you said right before I did it. Fire when ready. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this ship. Fire, Kelvax Dur said, and the word left him before he had fully finished deciding to say it, propelled by 3 centuries of momentum that did not know how to stop moving once it had built up this much speed. All batteries, all 50 vessels concentrated fire on that ship, now. 50 dreadnoughts opened fire simultaneously, and for 1/2 of 1 second the space around the second chance became a hell of pure light. Particle lances and railgun slugs and focused resonance beams converging from every angle of the crescent formation in a barrage that had, across 3 centuries of Concordance history, reduced entire orbital defense networks to expanding clouds of debris inside of 3 seconds. It was, by any reasonable measure, an apocalyptic amount of firepower concentrated with pinpoint precision onto a single target that had, by every law of physics the Threll understood, absolutely no business surviving the next heartbeat. The light met the human ship's shields and simply stopped. It did not flare, did not shimmer with the rainbow bleed of an overloading dispersal field, did not ripple or crack or show even the faintest hint of strain. The particle lances struck an invisible surface some 200 meters out from the hull and ceased to exist. Their energy dispersed so cleanly that the only visible sign anything had happened at all was a faint, gentle bloom of soft violet light across the shield's surface, and then nothing. The railgun slugs, capable of punching through 11 meters of Concordance capital ship armor, struck the same barrier and simply stopped moving, hanging suspended for a fraction of a second before their kinetic energy dissipated into nothing. The bridge of the vessel of deserved order went silent. 50 dreadnoughts worth of combined firepower spent in the span of 2 seconds, and the human ship hung in the wreckage of that silence exactly where it had been before, unmarked. Its light still pulsing that same slow, organic violet, entirely, completely untouched. Again, Kelvax Dur said, his voice tighter now. Continuous fire, all batteries, I want that shield down. The Concordance fleet fired continuously for nearly a full minute, an amount of sustained fire that would have caused catastrophic harmonic overload in any known shield architecture within the first 15 seconds. The human shield did not so much as flicker. Grand Overseer, it was Vashek again, his voice thin and strange. I am reading no degradation whatsoever in the shield harmonic, none. We have fired the equivalent sustained energy output of approximately 3 planetary bombardment campaigns directly into that shield in the last 50 seconds, and it has not lost a single percentage point of integrity. Grand Overseer, I do not believe we have a weapon in this fleet's arsenal capable of doing what you are asking it to do. Marisol's voice came back over the open channel, gentle rather than triumphant, the way you might speak to someone who had just badly misjudged a step and was still processing the fall. You felt that, right? 3 planetary bombardment campaigns, and my shields registered it about the same way I'd register somebody flicking a rubber band at a battleship. I want you to sit with that, Grand Overseer, because I think you called my species disgraced about 90 seconds before finding that out, and I think that's going to sting for a real long time. Now, her tone shifted, crisp and businesslike. I gave you the chance to just stand down and go home. You didn't take it, so here's what happens now. I'm going to walk through your formation, ship by ship, and take every single one of those 50 dreadnoughts offline cleanly, with minimal loss of life on your side if your crews are smart enough to abandon their weapons systems when I ask them to. I'd like everyone to survive this honestly, but I want you to understand something first. You had 50 ships and a century-old survey report. I have 1 ship, 2 species worth of allied engineering behind it, and about 4 minutes of actual work ahead of me. Let's begin. On the human ship's bridge, Marisol Achebe-Lund stood at the center of a command deck humming with quiet, confident energy, her crew moving with the unhurried precision of people who had drilled this exact scenario more times than any of them cared to count. Back when the second chance had still been a closely guarded secret built in a shipyard suspended in the debris field of a dead moon just past the Threll Concordance border, where no Concordance survey drone had ever thought to look twice. Her tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man named Commander Petrosian, sat at a console that looked almost peaceful in its simplicity. A calm violet targeting grid overlaying 50 distinct Threll hull signatures with the clinical patience of a surgeon reviewing a chart of vital signs. "Formations tightening around us, Captain," Petrosian said. "Standard concordance doctrine funnel the target into a crossfire kill box." "Let them," Marisol said, settling back, one boot crossed over the other knee. "Bring up the disable sequence. Engines and weapons only, minimal structural damage, give every crew on those ships the C. Hands to power down and survive their afternoon. Petrosian, you have firing solutions on all 50. All 50, Captain, resonance cannons tracking faster than they can maneuver. Whenever you're ready." "Then let's not keep the Grand Overseer waiting." Marisol nodded, and the open channel carried her voice to every bridge in that 50-ship formation, not just Kelvax Durs. "This is Captain Achebe-Lund, all concordance vessels. This message is for every crew in that formation, not just your Grand Overseer. In about 10 seconds, your engines and weapons systems are going to stop responding. This isn't damage the way you're used to thinking about damage. No hull breaches, no casualties, nothing your engineers can't fix once you're home. It's simply going to happen ship by ship, and there is nothing your point defense or your shields can do about it, because what's coming isn't going through your shields at all. If you value your crew, brace for a very confusing next few minutes and resist the urge to do anything heroic. Beginning now." Petrosian pressed a single control, and the resonance cannon, a weapon that projected a precisely tuned field of subspace resonance, developed jointly across 9 decades of quiet collaboration between human engineers and Threll-conquered physicists. A field that slid through conventional shielding the way sound slides through an open window, because it was never designed to stop something that arrived as neither physical matter nor electromagnetic radiation, reached out and touched the nearest Threll dreadnought. A mid-formation vessel called the Talon of Rightful Claim, and its engines simply died. On the bridge of the Talon, Captain Dresk Ilvain felt her ship shudder once gently, and every readout on her console went from green to a flat, sullen amber in the space of a single heartbeat. "Report," she snapped, and her engineering officer stared at his station with an expression of pure uncomprehending horror. "Captain, main engines are they're not damaged, there's no fault code, no fire, no breach, they're just off. Reactors still hot, still producing power, but nothing downstream of the primary coupling is responding. It's like someone reached in and turned a switch, except there is no switch, Captain, not one that exists in any schematic I've ever studied." "Weapons," Ilvain barked, already knowing before she finished the word. "Same, Captain, powered, charged, ready, and then not firing when I send the command. It's like the command itself is being erased before it reaches the actuator." Across the formation, the pattern repeated with a rhythm that within 90 seconds had become almost hypnotic. A slow, patient, surgical wave rolling outward from the human ship's position at the formation's dead center, touching one dreadnought after another, engines guttering to silence. Weapons batteries falling dark, each ship left drifting, intact, its crew alive and unharmed and utterly, helplessly disarmed. "Concentrate fire on the source signature," Kelvax Dur roared, spittle flying from mandibles that had lost every trace of the composed contempt he had carried into this system less than an hour ago. "I don't care what technology it's using, hit it with everything, all remaining active batteries." "Grand Overseer, 19 ships have already lost weapons capability," Usarel said, her voice tight, professional, the voice of a woman watching disaster unfold and trying to hold onto some fragment of procedure that might still matter. "The remaining 31 are firing everything they have, and it's making no difference whatsoever. The shield hasn't lost a single percentage point. Grand Overseer, I don't think this is a battle. I think this is a demonstration." It was at that moment that Captain Orvin Thask of the dreadnought Wrath Everlasting, watching his own weapons batteries flicker uselessly against a shield that had just no-sold his Grand Overseer's entire remaining fleet, made a decision that Threll tacticians would analyze for decades afterward as a cautionary example. If energy weapons could not touch the human vessel, he reasoned, in the desperate calculus of a man watching his career and possibly his life collapse in real time, then perhaps raw mass might succeed where focused fire had failed. He ordered his still-active engines to full emergency thrust and turned the entire 11 million-ton bulk of the Wrath Everlasting directly at the Second Chance's flank, intending to ram. Captain, Petrosian said, watching the dreadnought's vector shift on the tactical display with the mild, clinical interest of someone observing a well-understood phenomenon, "We've got a rammer. Wrath Everlasting coming in hot, ETA 40 seconds at current acceleration." "Let him come," Marisol said, not bothering to sit up straighter. "Shields'll hold against a collision the same as everything else. It's just kinetic energy, same physics as their railgun rounds, just S. Lower and heavier. Take his engines the moment he's committed to the vector. No sense letting him build more closing speed than he needs to feel it." 11 million tons of Threll dreadnought bore down on the Second Chance at a velocity that would have, against any conventional shield architecture, represented a genuine threat. The kind of desperate final gambit that occasionally worked precisely, because it was so reckless no defense had ever specifically been designed to counter it. Petrosian watched the range close, waited a few extra seconds purely so Captain Thask's crew would have no lingering doubt about what they had attempted, and then touched his console, and the Wrath Everlasting's engines died exactly as its captain committed irrevocably to the collision course, leaving it drifting, powerless. Its momentum carrying it on a final ballistic arc that brought it within 800 meters of the human hull before the shield's outer boundary, caught it as gently as a hand catching a thrown ball, arresting 11 million tons of momentum in absolute silence, and nudging it to a stop, hanging there against the shield's surface like a moth pressed against a window. "That," Marisol said into the open channel, something almost like genuine disappointment in her voice, "was either very brave or very stupid, Captain Thask, and I'm still deciding which. Nobody on your ship got hurt for what it's worth. But please, everyone, for the sake of my patience, if nothing else, no more ramming attempts. It genuinely doesn't do anything except waste everyone's time." "Retreat!" Kelvax Dur said the word like something bitter bitten into by accident, and for a long moment he simply stood there, mandibles working soundlessly, 3 centuries of unbroken conquest warring against the mounting evidence in front of him. A grand overseer of the Threll Concordance did not retreat from a single ship. It was not merely pride, but a matter of physics within the Concordance's own social order. A retreat here, broadcast as it surely would be across every allied and client channel within days, would not simply cost him this engagement. It would cost him his rank, his fleet, quite possibly his life once the compact finished deciding whose failure this had truly been. "No," he said finally, his voice hoarse in a way Threll physiology rarely allowed. "Reform the remaining vessels into a single concentrated firing line. All 29 converging fire, single point of impact, same coordinate on that hull, over and over until something gives. Rel, coordinate targeting across all remaining ships personally." Grand Overseer. Rel's voice had lost its professional smoothness entirely now, replaced by something rower, closer to a plea. "With respect, we've put 3 planetary bombardment campaigns worth of sustained fire into that shield already, scattered across dozens of separate volleys, and the shield harmonic hasn't degraded by a measurable fraction. Concentrating 29 ships' fire onto one point isn't going to change the fundamental problem, which is that we don't understand what we're shooting at. I don't think there's a version of this where more guns solves it. I think we should surrender the fleet, Grand Overseer, while there are still crews alive to surrender it with." Kelvax Dur turned on her with a violence that made 2 junior officers physically flinch back from their stations, and for one terrible second it looked as though he might strike his own fleet commander on the bridge in front of the entire crew. Then, just as suddenly, the fury seemed to drain out of him, replaced by something far more exhausted. "Do it," he said quietly. "Concentrate the fire. If we are wrong, Rel, then at least we will have been wrong while still trying. And that is the only dignity this fleet has left to offer its ancestors." The 29 remaining active dreadnoughts reformed with the desperate, ragged speed of a formation that had abandoned doctrine in favor of raw survival instinct, swinging their remaining firepower into a single overlapping barrage aimed at one precise point on the second chance's hull. The resulting bombardment was, by any measure, the single largest concentrated weapons discharge the Threll Concordance had ever attempted in 3 centuries of largely bloodless conquest, an amount of energy that would have vaporized a moon-sized asteroid in the time it took to give the order, all of it converging on a patch of shielded hull perhaps 40 meters across. The shield held, it did not strain. It did not shimmer with the faintest hint of overload. The same soft violet bloom rippled across its surface, gentle and patient as a lake receiving rain, and when the barrage finally ceased, the hull beneath remained exactly as unmarked as it had been before Kelvax-Dur had given the order at all. "Grand Overseer," Marisol's voice said, something almost sad in it now, sad the way you might feel watching someone. Stubbornly repeat a mistake they'd already been warned about. "I want you to know I actually held my breath a little on that one, just to see if 29 ships concentrating like that would do something interesting. It didn't. I'm sorry genuinely, not sarcastically, that this had to go all the way to your absolute maximum effort before you believed me. 29 ships left. Please stand down the remainder before anyone gets hurt who doesn't need to be." The remaining 28 dreadnoughts fell in a steady, unhurried rhythm after that, the resonance cannon sweeping through the formation with the same patient thoroughness it had shown from the very first ship. Engines guttering dark, weapons batteries falling silent, crew after Threll crew left staring at consoles that simply refused to respond to commands their training told them should be simple, should be reliable, should never fail all at once across an entire fleet without a single visible cause. Marisol kept the channel open the whole time, narrating in the same calm, almost conversational tone she'd carried since the very first volley. Less a battle report than something closer to a lesson everyone present was going to remember for the rest of their careers. 38 down, she said, watching another hull signature slide to gray on the tactical display. "That's the ship on your northeastern flank, Grand Overseer Talon of the Second Dawn, according to the transponder. Nice name, 39 now, 41. Grand Overseer, we're coming up on the end of this pretty quickly now, and I want to ask you something because I think it matters how the history gets written. Do you want to order the rest of your fleet to power down voluntarily, or do you want me to keep doing it for you? Not being cute about it, I genuinely think it matters, for your crew's sake, and for whatever gets reported back to your compact, whether this ends with you giving an order or with you just running out of ships." Kelvax-Dur stood on the bridge of his own flagship, the last vessel in the formation still showing full weapons capability on Vashek's increasingly desperate scans, and felt the full weight of 3 centuries of unbroken conquest collapse inward on itself like a dying star. Around him, 49 dreadnoughts hung dark and drifting against the starfield, their crews alive, their hulls intact, their captains staring in stunned silence at readouts that told a story none of their training had ever prepared them to read. He thought with a bitterness that surprised him with its intensity of the message he had broadcast less than an hour ago, the one calling this species banished, disgraced, unworthy of galactic recognition. A message that whatever remained of humanity's scattered colonies had heard with their own ears before watching this single ship prove every syllable of it catastrophically, historically wrong. "Order it," he said finally, and the words cost him something he suspected he would spend the rest of his career and possibly the rest of his life trying to name. "Power down remaining weapons. All crews brace for," he stopped, aware of how absurd the next word was going to sound, and said it anyway because there was nothing left to say that would sound any less absurd. "Brace for whatever this ship intends to do to us next." "Nothing," Marisol said, and the immediacy of the answer, the simple flatness of it, seemed to catch even Kelvax-Dur off guard. "That's it. That's the whole plan, Grand Overseer. Your fleet is disarmed. Nobody's dead. Your crews get to fly home, minus their weapons and most of their engine capacity for the trip. which I'll admit is going to make for a long, awkward journey back to whatever border you came from, and I apologize for that part genuinely, but I think it's a fair price for what you tried to do to a species you'd already written off a century ago. I'm not going to destroy your fleet, Grand Overseer. I don't need to. 50 disarmed dreadnoughts limping home to report exactly what happened here today is going to do a lot more long-term work than 50 wrecks would have. A wreck's just a tragedy. A story like this is going to travel. And I think that's exactly what we want, not just for the Concordance to hear it, but for every species out past your border who's ever been told they didn't matter enough for anyone to invest in. I think they deserve to know what happened when somebody finally did. There was a long silence on the Concordance channel, 50 bridges worth of officers absorbing the particular specific humiliation of having been not destroyed, not even seriously damaged, but simply and thoroughly outclassed by a single vessel that had, by its own captain's account, spent perhaps 4 minutes of actual effort disarming an entire armada that had arrived expecting an afternoon's easy reclamation. Kelvax Dur found himself staring at the black hull hanging serene and untouched in the wreckage of his own formation's pride, and understood with the particular clarity that only comes after every alternative has been exhausted, that he was looking at something his species had never once, in 3 centuries of expansion, actually encountered before. A fight they could not win, offered by an opponent who had never for 1 second doubted the outcome. Captain Achebe-Lund, he said, and it took every remaining fragment of his composure to keep his voice level, I will carry your message back to the compact myself, and I will carry it accurately, whatever the cost to my own standing in doing so. I ask only one question before we withdraw, and I ask it honestly, not as a tactic. Your species was banished for instability, for a lack of technological maturity that our own survey division documented extensively before the quarantine was ever imposed. What changed? What did we fail to understand in a century of careful, deliberate isolation about a species we believed we had thoroughly assessed? Marisol considered the question for a moment before answering, and when she did, there was no triumph in her voice at all, only something quieter, almost weary, the particular tiredness of someone who had spent her whole career preparing for a day she had hoped, in some private corner of herself, might never actually arrive. Honestly, Grand Overseer, I think the Compact banished us for being exactly what we were back then. Fractious. Loud. Fighting each other over things that, looking back, feel almost embarrassingly small now. All true, by the way, we really were that, not that long ago, and I won't pretend otherwise. What the Compact never bothered to find out is what happens to a species like that when somebody finally treats it like it's worth the effort instead of writing it off as a lost cause. The Threll Concordance didn't quarantine us or catalog us or file us away as a diplomatic embarrassment, Grand Overseer. They found a couple of our lost colony ships drifting near their border 90 years ago, and instead of turning us away or reporting us to your compact for tidy disposal, they just talked to us, taught us things. Let us make mistakes without deciding those mistakes defined us forever. 90 years is a long time to spend being told consistently by people who had no obligation to bother that you're worth investing in. Turns out that changes a species a lot faster than a century of being locked out and ignored ever could have. You didn't fail to understand us because your survey division was incompetent, Grand Overseer. You failed to understand us because your compact decided a century ago that we weren't worth the effort of understanding at all, and somebody else disagreed, and here we are. Go home, she continued, more gently now. Tell your compact the truth, the whole truth, not the version that makes today easier to explain. And Grand Overseer, when you file your report, I'd appreciate it if you mentioned the Threll Concordance by name. They've spent 90 years being quietly, patiently kind to a species nobody else wanted, and I think that kindness just changed the balance of power in this entire sector more than any weapon either of our peoples ever built. I think that's worth your compact understanding clearly, before they decide to write off anyone else the way they wrote off us. The Concordance peacekeeping fleet withdrew from the Sol system over the following 6 hours, 49 dreadnoughts crawling toward the system's edge on auxiliary thrusters at a crawling fraction of their normal cruising speed, their weapon systems dark, their crews subdued in a silence that would follow them all the way back to concordant space. And in the months and years that followed, all the way through everyday briefing, every tribunal. Every desperate closed-door session of the Compact trying to understand exactly what had happened at the edge of a system they had catalogued as banished and beneath consideration less than a day before. Kelvax Dur's flagship left last, trailing the rest of the crawling formation home, and on its bridge in the quiet hours of that long retreat, more than one officer found themselves replaying the recording of Captain Marisol Achebe-Lund's voice, the calm of it, the near gentleness of it, and understanding with a cold certainty that would follow them for the rest of their careers that they had just met, for the first time in 3 centuries of unbroken concordance expansion. A species that had not needed to raise its voice even once to win, and a species that had found, in exile, exactly the kind of allies the Compact had never once bothered to become. Below, on the scattered remnants of human civilization, the handful of colonies still clinging to survival along the quarantine's old border, the reconstructed cities of Earth itself, still bearing the scars of the fractious century that had earned the species its exile in the first place, the broadcast of that in tier. E-exchange, recorded, transcribed, and released to every surviving human network within minutes of the Concordance fleet's withdrawal, spread across a fractured, isolated species with a speed that made every previous moment of shared human attention across the long quarantine look glacial by comparison. Billions of people who had spent a century being told, quietly and then not so quietly, that they were an embarrassment to the wider galaxy, unworthy of contact, unworthy of alliance, unworthy of anything but careful isolation, spent the following days watching and rewatching footage of a single Concordance dreadnought hanging pinned and drifting against an unbothered violet shield, of Captain Marisol Achebe-Lund's calm, unbothered voice patiently counting down an armada one ship at a time, of a Grand Overseer's 3 centuries of certainty cracking open in real time on an open channel that the whole species had, by pure historical accident, been listening to when it happened. Governments that had spent a century arguing, sometimes bitterly, about how much of humanity's scarce remaining resources should be devoted to a secret shipbuilding program most citizens had never been told existed, found themselves, within days, fielding an entirely different set of questions from a public that wanted to know everything about the Threll Concordance, about the 9 decades of quiet collaboration that had produced the Second Chance, about what kind of species reaches across a diplomatic quarantine to help a people everyone else had already decided to write off. Ambassador Keth Van Solari of the Threll Concordance, who had spent the better part of 4 decades personally overseeing the joint engineering program from a quiet outpost just past the old quarantine line, gave a single public statement in the days following the Concordance withdrawal, broadcast simultaneously to every human network, and to the wider Threll diplomatic corps that would be quoted for generations afterward on both sides of the old border. "We found your colony ships 90 years ago," Ambassador Solari said, drifting, half-powered, crewed by people who had been told by an entire galaxy that they did not matter enough to be worth saving, let alone helped. "We disagreed with that assessment then, and we disagree with it now, and I want to be very clear about why. It was never charity. We did not help your species because we pitied you or because we saw some easy strategic advantage in a broken, banished people. We helped you because 90 years ago, sitting across a table from your survivors, we saw a species that had been knocked down about as far as a civilization can be knocked down. And instead of giving up, instead of accepting the quarantine's verdict about what you were worth, you kept trying. You kept building. You kept arguing with each other about how to do things better, which I understand your species considers a flaw, but which we came to understand over 9 decades of close partnership as the exact opposite of a flaw. It is the sound of a civilization that has not yet decided what its ceiling is, and refuses to let anyone else decide that ceiling for you either. We are proud of what we built together. We hope every species listening to this broadcast, on either side of the old Compact's borders, understands that the lesson of today was never really about weapons or shields or fleet tactics. It was about what happens when you refuse to let 100 years of being told you don't matter convince you that it's true. Word of the confrontation at Saul traveled in the weeks and months that followed through every allied and client channel the Threll Concordance maintained across its considerable territory, carried not as the story of a fleet destroyed, which every species in that region of the galaxy had heard 100 times before and largely stopped finding remarkable, but as the far stranger, far more unsettling story of a fleet of 50 that had been humiliated without a single casualty by one ship that never once needed to fire a shot to prove its point, commanded by a species that a century ago had been formally banished from galactic recognition, quietly rescued from obscurity by allies nobody had expected, and had somehow, across 90 years nobody outside their own small circle had ever bothered to watch closely, become something else entirely. The compact in the tense weeks of debriefing that followed Kelvax Dur's return would eventually settle on an official reclassification for the species designated Homo sapiens, striking the old quarantine order from every record with a formality that fooled absolutely no one about how thoroughly, how completely, and how permanently that century-old judgment had been overturned in the span of a single afternoon at the edge of an unremarkable little solar system that the rest of the galaxy, from that day forward, learned to approach with considerably more caution and considerably more curiosity about exactly who else, quietly, patiently, might be worth taking a chance on. In the years that followed, military historians on both sides of the old quarantine line would return again and again to the tactical record of that single afternoon, poring over the recovered sensor logs from all 50 Concordance dreadnoughts in an effort to understand, in granular detail, exactly how a single human vessel had managed to systematically dismantle an entire peacekeeping fleet without ever repositioning from the exact coordinate at which it had first translated into existence. The answer, once properly reconstructed, proved almost insultingly simple in its elegance. The second chance's resonance array did not need to maneuver at all, because it did not fire in any conventional sense that required line of sight or angular tracking the way Concordance weapon systems did. It simply extended a field, patient and omnidirectional, that swept outward from the ship's hull in slow, concentric waves, identifying and neutralizing target signatures in an order Marisol's tactical staff had pre-selected based on threat priority, beginning with the ships closest to the formation center and working outward toward the crescent's flanks, a targeting philosophy that meant every desperate maneuver the Concordance fleet attempted, the flanking wings folding inward. The northern cluster's failed breakaway run, Captain Thask's doomed ramming attempt, had been, from the very first moment of the engagement, already accounted for in the pattern of the sweep, the way a spider's web accounts for a struggling fly's every possible direction of escape before the fly has even finished struggling. They never had a chance to outmaneuver us, Petrosian would later explain in the extensive debriefing sessions that followed the engagement, sessions that would eventually be compiled into the founding curriculum of humanity's first properly reconstituted naval academy in over a century. Because the entire concept of maneuver assumes your opponent is responding to your position in real time, adjusting their targeting solution based on where you are and where you're going. The resonance field doesn't work that way. It doesn't care where a ship is relative to us. It cares what a ship is structurally and energetically, and once you've mapped that signature, distance, and vector become almost irrelevant. The Talon of rightful claim could have run for the far edge of the system at full burn the instant we translated in, and it wouldn't have mattered because the field would have found it eventually regardless, the same way it found every other ship in that formation. I think that's the part of this battle that's going to keep Concordance tacticians up at night for the next several decades. More than the shields, more than the ramming attempt, more than any of it. We didn't win a battle of maneuver against them. We made maneuver itself irrelevant, and I don't think there's a doctrine in their entire 900-system compact that has an answer for a weapon that simply doesn't care how well you fly. Aboard the Talon of rightful claim, in the long, silent hours of the crawling retreat back toward Concordance space, Captain Dresk Ilvain found herself standing alone at her darkened weapons station. Staring at a console that had less than a day earlier represented 3 centuries of Threll military supremacy and now sat inert, dead, as useless as a piece of decorative sculpture, and found herself thinking, with a discomfort she did not immediately recognize the source of a phrase her own academy instructors had drilled into her class during her earliest years of training: that the Concordance did not lose wars because the Concordance did not fight wars it could lose, that every engagement in 3 centuries of expansion had been carefully calculated in advance to guarantee an overwhelming and essentially bloodless victory before the first shot was ever fired. She understood now, standing in the wreckage of that doctrine, that the calculation had never once considered the possibility of an opponent who had spent a century of exile quietly, patiently building something the Concordance's own survey division had simply never thought to look for. And she found herself wondering, in the private, unspoken way career officers rarely permitted themselves to wonder about anything, how many other species scattered across the wider galaxy's forgotten margins, banished or quarantined or simply overlooked, might be quietly building the same kind of unwelcome surprise, waiting only for anyone, to finally give them a reason to use it. Back on Earth, in the crowded public square of a rebuilt coastal city that had spent the century since the quarantine slowly recovering from the fractious conflicts that had earned humanity its exile in the first place, 11-year-old Amara Ilsanmi stood pressed against her grandmother's side, watching the recorded footage of Marisol Achebe-Lund's calm, unbothered voice play across a massive public display screen for what was, by the crowd's own count, at least the 4th time that evening, and felt something she did not yet have adult vocabulary to properly describe, though she would spend much of the following decade trying to find it, eventually settling in a university thesis written 12 years later on the psychological impact of the Sol system engagement on post-quarantine human identity. On the word unashamed, a feeling of being, for the first time in her short life, part of a species that the rest of the galaxy had just been forced to admit it had badly, catastrophically underestimated. "Grandma," she said, tugging at her grandmother's sleeve as the footage looped back to its beginning, to Marisol's easy, unhurried opening line about beautifully maintained fleet spacing, "were we really banished? Like actually banished, not just moved somewhere else?" Her grandmother, who had been a young woman during the quarantine's darkest years, who remembered clearly what it had felt like to grow up under the particular, specific shame of being told by an entire galaxy that her species was too broken to be trusted with anything beyond its own small, isolated corner of space, considered the question for a long moment before answering, watching the same footage loop for what was, for her, considerably more than the 4th time that day. "We were, sweetheart," she said finally. "For a long time we were banished, and a lot of people believed that meant we deserved it, that we were exactly as broken as everyone said we were. But I want you to remember something about today, something I don't think you're old enough yet to fully understand, but I hope you'll remember it anyway when you are. Being banished isn't the same as being finished. Sometimes the people who get told they don't matter are exactly the ones who end up mattering most, once somebody finally gives them a chance to prove it. Don't ever let anyone tell you a closed door is the same thing as the end of the story. Ours certainly wasn't."